I'm with Roland Fumasi, and he's the head of RaboResearch, Food and Agribusiness for North America. And so you did a talk earlier, and you talked about the almond market and how we're starting to have a rebound, hopefully here in the next couple of years. Can you talk about some of the things that are kind of stabilizing that market right now?
Sure, absolutely, Kristen. One of the most important things going on in the almond space right now is the fact that our carry into the 2024-25 marketing year is going to be much more manageable, right? Not quite cut in half, but pretty darn close. A major reduction, right? Under 500 million pounds, very likely. So that's a very powerful force, because that big carryout we've seen the last couple of years has gotten us into some market trouble. So that's one piece. The other piece of the puzzle is we think the overall macroeconomic environment's going to get better over the next couple of years, right? We're already seeing central banks around the world start to lower interest rates. We expect the Fed here in the U.S. to start to lower interest rates. That's important in the U.S. because as that happens, we should start to see the dollar weaken up a little bit, which will help exports, all else equal. So those are two stabilizing forces that we think are important, right? And the reason that the central banks are able to do that is because we see inflation finally easing,
Right.
which is really positive from a consumer perspective, which should start to loosen things up on the consumer a bit, and that's positive for ongoing almond demand.
Yeah. You know, you referred to it as a perfect storm was kind of what helped the whole stabilization process. But what are we seeing for walnuts? Is that perfect storm going to help alleviate the walnut stress?
Well, just to be clear, the perfect storm was the situation we've seen for the last few years that we're finally out of, or getting out of. Walnuts is a whole different ballgame. You look at the global dynamics of walnuts. There's a lot more walnuts consumed in the world than pistachios or almonds, but that consumption is largely in-country production. So all those countries around the world that are eating a lot of walnuts, they don't have to rely on exports from the U.S., right? So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that yes, we know we've been competing in the export market with Chile for some time, but now, over the last 5-ish years, China has actually become a growing walnut exporter. So that puts more pressure on the system as well. So we probably need to continue over the next couple of years to continue to pull back our walnut production here in California.
Right. So you're having to deal with a whole lot of things that you weren't having to deal with before. With everyone's still eating walnuts in the world, but they're just maybe growing them themselves, and they're not depending on us as much as they used to. Is that right?
Well, that's and yes, that's a true statement. And they haven't necessarily, when you look at walnuts, haven't necessarily relied on California exports as in terms of a proportion of global consumption. Yes, California exports have helped grow global consumption of walnuts, but the amount of walnut consumption that depends on trade is just a much smaller proportion versus pistachios and almonds, right? The world to a large extent relies on California almonds and pistachios to meet its growing consumption. That's much less critical in walnuts because there's so much major production in other parts of the world.
So besides some of the things that we've just been talking about, what are some of the other things that you're hearing from growers and processors across the board that is of concern to them? What's keeping them up at night, and what's keeping you up at night for that matter?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, when you think of tree nuts in the U.S., it's California, right? I mean, I know that we're starting to grow some things across the border in Arizona, et cetera, but, so when you look at California, certainly the regulatory environment will continue to be challenging. It's great to hear the hard work that WAPA is doing. It's so good to be at the conference and the work they're putting in to try to manage that for the industry as best they can, right? So regulatory, and then the other big two would be water and labor, right? Water is going to continue to be a challenge. We know that. We know that we're starting to get into Sigma now, been around technically for a decade, but it's going to continue to put pressure on our industry in earnest more and more as the years go by. And then, of course, on the labor front. Yes, tree nuts have the advantage on farm of being less labor intensive than a lot of other California crops. But then when you think about our processors in the tree nut industry, still heavily reliant on labor. So we're seeing a lot more adoption of technologies, which cost a lot of money to replace that labor. So it's going to be all about technology.